Okay, hello, my name's Trevor, and I'm presenting on some cool projects that I've been, I guess, doing in my free time. Just decided, why not? I love hardware, so this is mainly going to be focused on hardware. But there's my disclaimer. If you break it, it's not my fault. You're going to do this on your own risk, kind of stuff. I mean, I've broken stuff, and I'll get to that in the presentation. So. Be wary when you're doing this kind of stuff, and also, yeah, the top line is this is all my independent stuff. This is nothing to do with my employer or anything like that. So, anyways, also shameless plug. Check out my website. I'll have these slides up there and some resources there afterwards. There's only like 2 things on there now, but you can go check it out if you want. Also, connect with me on LinkedIn if you want, because I gotta get my LinkedIn up there. And then also, I don't like when people wait till the end of the presentation to ask questions, so go ahead and just raise your hand and I'll call on you if you have questions, because I know I forget questions during the presentation, so just go ahead and raise your hand. So mainly this is about physical device security and like hardware hacking. So this might seem obvious, but like, why is it important? Well, it makes the tampering of the devices harder. So if I go into a situation where there's devices that are able to be pwned just by sticking a USB stick into them. That's bad, obviously. That's something we don't want. So all these new IoT devices that are out there that have Wi-Fi, USB, HDMI, all these different stuff can get tampered with really easily, even over USB in a matter of seconds. Like, just walk up, plug in, walk away. So obviously local network security matters too. So if you're running a telnet, just open root. You can just log in if you just hop on the Wi-Fi. That's bad. We'll get to that later. And then obviously you have your DDoS stuff like botnets and spying and stuff like that. So those are some examples down there at the bottom. More commonly, you can probably know these as jailbreaking or rooting. Similar to what we're doing today, kind of what I'm going to be showing, but not really on like phones. It's more like some devices up here like cameras and like media home streamers and stuff like that. So first off, what really got me into this was this little D-Link movie night thing. It's from like 2012, so it's really old, which is great. You know, old stuff is usually really vulnerable. So it's just a simple media player, has HDMI on it. It's right here. I took it apart, so it's kind of destroyed, and there's just a circuit board sitting up here, and I lost the screws to it a long time ago. But it runs a really old version of YouTube and Netflix, and it connects with other D-Link products like cameras and stuff like that. So some weird stuff packed into this little box, and it's kind of powerful, honestly, if you think about it. Like, this tiny little box from 2012 can run Netflix and YouTube. What do you think else can it do? It's not just it's like a smartphone packed in a box, pretty much. So what to look for? Once you take it apart, you can kind of see there's this green circuit board inside, the green mask and everything, and the big heat sink on the top there is, in the middle is the, underneath that is the ARM processor. So a lot of things nowadays use ARM because it's cheap and easy to use and easy to program for. There's a lot of libraries out there, pretty easy. So, and then off on the right you can see that Wi-Fi card. That's actually, if you can come up here later, you can see there's actually like a mini PCIe Wi-Fi card in here, which when I opened it up I was like, why would they do that? That's like way more expensive than just slapping some cheap Wi-Fi card on there, like an ESP8266, I think is the number. Well, I actually found out that this is since it's from 2012, ESP32 and all those different iterations don't really exist yet, so they just kind of had to pull some off the shelf and probably just stick it on there. So that's, I think, why they did that, but who knows? It could be some person at D-Link being weird and decide I just want to use this stock we had in the back room somewhere. So this thing is kind of neat because it has a remote, an IR remote to it too. So this window's broken out of it. I got it that way. But when you open stuff up like this, you can see the wires going off to the Arduino, and I'll get to that in a second. But when you're hardware hacking, you gotta kind of look at these. You gotta know what to look for, and there's a lot of debug pins and stuff like that in these kind of devices that are used to program the flash, to program the microcontroller itself, to do updates at the factory, which is kind of weird, but most of the time what happens is when the vendors send these things out, they slap them together, say, we're gonna do the minimal amount possible, and then ship it out the door. So a lot of the times these debug pins just get left on, they're just spewing stuff out there like debug information and stuff out to the serial interface all the time for the rest of their lives until they're thrown away or destroyed or poured water on by some kid. So this is what you gotta kind of look for. And there's some specific pins. There's a lot of out there. There's like JTAG and serial and custom ones and that kind of stuff. I recommend looking at the exploiteers if you guys want to do that. I'll put a link up at my website if you want to later. They're kind of old. They're from DEF CON. I forgot to put them in this presentation, but yeah. So moving on. I'm cheap. And when I was messing around with this, I'm like, I don't want to wait for eBay and Amazon because, you know, eBay and Amazon are slow and it takes 2 days and I'm instant gratification type of guy. So on the left, you see the USB serial adapter. It's like a TF something serial adapter. I don't know the exact name of it, but pretty much what it does is it converts USB and into a serial interface. So usually you can get transmit, receive, ground, and power. In this case, we don't really care about power because the device has its own power supply in it, and most devices do. If you want to use the power supply, you can, but it's not recommended because when you feed power into it, it can cause problems and do under voltage kind of stuff. But most of the time, you can just turn it on and it'll be right there and debug information's right there. So, but I don't have one of those. So what do you think I did? I pulled out my trusty Arduino that I've had for probably 10 years now, like an original Arduino, not a clone board. This clone board works too if you want to. But I said, there's gotta be a way to do this. Well, it turns out the Arduino actually has one of those chips on it. I think it's this tiny chip right here. This is probably Ethernet controller, but it's probably like this guy right here, or one of those small chips down there that turns your USB interface into a serial programmer to program the ATmega chip in there, that big long chip. And so I was like, there's got to be a way to use that, right? Well, there is. So I found this cool website that I think it was on Instructables actually, where it actually you just do some pins together and just reset the microcontroller so it never turns on, and then override or use the serial interface to then interface with the device itself, which is really easy. It took me, I think, longer to solder on the pins than it did to hook up the Arduino. And you can't really mess it up because if you switch the transmit and receive because they're not labeled, you just flip them around and you'll just get garbled output if you do it the wrong way. So you can see here's a little bit better picture of how it's hooked up at the end. You can see the Arduino on the left there. That little red wire is actually tying the ground to the reset pin on the Arduino, so the ATmega chip is actually completely turned off in this. It's like reset state constantly. Like every tick, it's just resetting. So you don't have to worry about that. I don't even know what I have on my Arduino right now. It could be running some weird code or something, I don't know. But then on the kind of the right of the Arduino, those yellow and white wires go to the board itself. And then there's also a green one that goes to ground. But that's kind of important too, because you got to have a base reference for voltage. If you guys have taken EE230 or anything like that, you kind of know the voltage levels matters when you're dealing with digital logic. So when you're dealing with serial, you kind of got to know that ground plane, whether to deal with a 0 or 1. So those are only 3 wires it takes to connect this thing up to my computer and mess around with serial. So first time I did, I got a garbled output. And so I was like, that's kind of weird. So I was like, maybe I just got it wrong. Maybe I got them flipped around. So I flipped them around, and let me see if this works. I'm actually going to bring this up here. This thing's kind of delicate, so if it doesn't work, it's because it's super delicate, and it's probably broken in transit. So yes, I've had this thing break like 6 times when I'm trying to do stuff. So we are going to go to putty. And we're just gonna, oops, no, that's the wrong one. 1 second. Oops. I'm just gonna switch over to the document camera. Is there a way to switch? Okay, great. Oh, there it is. It's a button that says Doc Cam on it, of course. So here's the movie night that I was talking about earlier. So the Arduino's down here. It's not really great contrast, but whatever. The red wire is that wire I was talking about earlier still, and I had to change the green wire to a blue wire because it broke off, like I said before. So you can see up here this is where it connects to it, and it goes down to the Arduino. So if I can, let's see if I plug this in, what happens. So when you plug it in your computer, usually it pops up as a serial device, and One second, I got to check device manager to see which COM device it popped up as. So you can check device manager. I'll plug actually back in and show you what to look for. So when you go to serial devices, if it stops refreshing so I can see it, ports, there it is. You can see there's a USB serial device right there. That's the COM3. So when we go over to PuTTY, what we're going to do is we're going to change this to COM3. And PuTTY's great because I'm a Windows guy and I don't do a bunch of Linux serial stuff. I mean, there's probably a way to do this in Linux, but I know how to do it in PuTTY, so I'm going to do it in PuTTY. But a lot of people don't know that PuTTY actually has serial support, so you can actually just open up a random serial thing to your Arduino or anything like that. You can also do this in an Arduino Studio Editor too if you want. Just open up a serial communication, but that's the same principle as this. I just know it better. So, recommend doing speeds too is a big problem. So when you're messing around with this, there's no data sheet for this device that says, oh, here's the speed for the serial interface. No. So you kind of just have to poke around and say, okay, 9600, is that the right serial speed? Okay, it's not. Usually there's a couple common ones like 9600, 115,200 is a really popular one. If you just search up serial baud rates, you can just go through them, and that's what I had to do. And I just got to the 115,200, and I was like, perfect, it works. So if we open this up, I'm going to plug this in first. And then we got to turn it on. Okay, it looks like it's maybe doing the wrong way. Let's see. So you can see we're getting output to the serial from this. So if we switch over to the dot cam real fast, you can see there's just a light on. There's nothing's happening right now. Like if you boot this up and plug it into HDMI, it's probably just some random like boot up screen. So if we switch back to PuTTY, or to PuTTY, you can see it's just dumping stuff out to the terminal, and you're like, this might be useless, and it's really fast. But sometimes you just gotta wait, especially when it boots up. So we're gonna wait a second and see if anything pops up. Sometimes you have to press enter too, so if we just press enter a bunch, oh look, that looks familiar. SH, that's shell. What? How can you get shell over serial? Well, if you know anything about networking, if you deal with switches at all, you can actually plug into the back of switches with an Ethernet or RJ45 connector, and then that goes to a serial thing you plug in your computer for configuration. This is the same thing, except in a consumer device that has 3 wires instead of the whole 8 wires in the RJ45. So what do you think we can do? Well, this is a lot of random garbage just getting printed out. Sometimes it takes a really long time to just stop doing this. So if we poke around, we can try to find some way to get like telnet on there even. But I personally found a way to do it, but I've forgotten what command it was. I think it's like inetd or something like that to get telnet open, and you can actually telnet into it then with root. So I'm actually gonna try inetd and see. Well, it didn't air out, so let's open up another PuTTY window and see. Well, we don't have, this also isn't connected to the Wi-Fi right now, so I didn't bring a router and everything to connect this to. But now that this is actually, if I do like who am I, or who. See, you can't you don't know who you are because you can't, this is like bare bones. Like I think there's like 200 megabytes of like system ROM on here, so there's like no room for any extra stuff. So they strip everything out that they don't need. So there's no there's no who am I or anything like that. But there is stuff like CD, so I can like ls and stuff like that, or CD/. And then you can see there's like regular Linux. It's like you have etc, init, proc, root, everything like that, var. So you can go poking around these things and then install your own stuff. If you find your own binaries for FTP or something like that, you could technically install FTP on here and just have an FTP file server running if it's not already on there. This already has telnet-d running or installed on it, so you could just start up telnet-d and have a telnet thing on here and then do commands from there. So yeah, so that's that. I'm gonna exit out here and turn this off. Yes.
So
it's really loud.
It keeps trying to ping google.com. Is that like a script you threw on there, or is that
no?
a way of checking
This is completely stock. I don't think I've done anything like installed anything on there, but I'm pretty sure that what this is doing is it's checking if the Wi-Fi is on or not. So it's actually pinging. Yeah, just Google. It's just saying like, if Google's down, the internet's probably down, so we're just gonna check. Like obviously everybody laughs, but what if 30 years down the line, Google changes everything to use, they don't do IPv4 anymore, then this device might be bricked. So you gotta think of something like that when you're designing these kind of devices, and maybe a firmware update will do it, but you think D-Link, the makers of this thing, is going to release a firmware update 30 years after they released it? No. They can barely do 5 years now with their Wi-Fi router, so no, they're definitely not going to. But yeah, so let's move on from there. Yes, I'll unplug this. Unplug all this stuff. And continue. Hopefully this is the right one, yeah. So next up is another D-Link product. I don't know why I got addicted to D-Link, but I did. So D-Link's known for their bad security if you know the industry at all. This is another camera, or this is just another D-Link product, just a simple 720p HD Wi-Fi camera from back in like 2013. Ironically, actually, going back to this movie night and the camera, I don't have it with me. I lost it because I'll get to that in a second. But I actually found these both on Facebook Marketplace. I scroll in there every once in a while, and I was looking, and the movie night I found on Facebook Marketplace for $5 because it was old and nobody wanted it. So I was like, perfect, college budget. That's $5 is something I can afford, not $400 like some other cameras. This was $10, I think, and it was pretty cheap. So I was like, perfect camera. We can get into cameras. I know D-Link. There's probably a debug port on it somewhere. So it has like IR for night vision and all this different stuff, but it has a web interface, which is really cool. So then you can do like web injection. So this doesn't really have a this movie night doesn't have a web interface. So you can't really do any like command injection and stuff like that, like over like your computer, but this does. And the firmware is available online for download. The movie night wasn't. They don't have any firmware updates for it online, but this one does. So we'll get into that in a second. But first, you gotta open it up. The movie night was easy because there's 4 screws. Unscrew them underneath the feet, take it apart, it just falls apart. Everything's just done. But this one's a little harder. So when I first looked at it, there's no obvious screws on the outside, so we're like, well, maybe you have to use heat, maybe you have to, like, there's clips or anything like that. But here's some really cool links right here to, or stuff right here that I use. I use iFixit, Google search to find the service manual. Service manuals, if the company has them, they're probably a good company. ThinkPads always have the service manuals to tear them apart to do anything like that. Great stuff when you find a service manual. That means you're probably going to be able to poke around in it without not much problem. Ironically, YouTube videos, for some reason, there's just people just take apart random junk online and decide that they want to video themselves doing it and put some crappy audio from 2012 on it, and then put it up forever, and then you just watch it, and it shows you how to take it apart. And I've actually been stuck on a lot of stuff, like laptops and stuff like that, that when you take them apart, you get stuck. Also blog posts, some people put like their blog to tear apart stuff. It's like not iFixit, but if you search it, it'll be like one of the first ones that pops up. That's really nice. And then also, really big thing, FCC ID. Anything with a wireless connection on it, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, Zigbee, Z-Wave, whatever, has to be in the, if it's sold commercially, it has to have an FCC ID on it. And if you search it up, you have to have internal photos when you submit that. They might not be what the consumer gets, but it's really close. So it can also show chip information and debug stuff. So if you're like, I don't know what chip this runs on. Is it ARM? Is it like some weird x86 chip that's really tiny? Is it MIPS even? You can actually just like zoom in on the pictures on the PDF and just right there. And we'll get to that soon, where I'll actually go to the FCCID.io site and we'll pull it up. But first, we're going to go to the iFixit one. So how many of you here have heard of iFixit? Probably most people have either at least heard of it. It's really nice. They have free repair manuals for a ton of stuff, most large cell phones, even this tiny D-Link thing, and people can actually put their own stuff on here. So you can see this is actually the camera taken apart right here on the left, and it says it's pretty easy. I have to disagree, but we'll get to that in a second. So you can see all the steps are right here. It just, there's a couple screws in the back, and then you're done. You just have the board right there. And you can kind of see here, there's a little debug port right here, if you can kind of see it. It's not really that big. It's 4 pins, just like the other one. It's probably a serial port of some kind, which is great. And then we can poke in it, and then we'll be good. And then we can just probably have a serial output again, which then we have root in the camera, and then we can do whatever we want. But let's go back here. Oops. So, things break really easily, I found out. So the movie night I didn't have any problems with. Like, my own soldering's pretty crappy, so I didn't think of anything of it. But when you have clips holding things together, there's problems. It looked like someone maybe had tried to take this camera apart before, which is a problem because they strip the screws, because these screws are usually one-time use, put them in the factory and they never come apart. So they use cheap stuff. They use aluminum or whatever is the lowest price per screw they can get at that moment. And it's just bad. Bad repair, future repair ability, I guess. So, also, circuit boards are not indestructible. If you bend them too far, they will crack and break, and even if you don't hear them or see them break, they can be broken on the inside because you have multiple layers, and those multiple layers can just fracture in the middle, and then you're screwed. Also, the debug ports might be closed, as I mentioned earlier, and those things might not be even debug ports at all. They could just be some random port that does for like LEDs or some other weird connector on there. So, but most companies are lazy like D-Link, and they just leave them on there. The problem I had with the camera is I took it apart, and it took me a really long time. One of the screws was stripped, so I had to drill it out. Then when I opened it up, it got to the circuit board, tried to power it on, it wouldn't power on, no lights would show up, and I was like, that's kind of weird. And as I was moving it, I put my hand on the main chip, and it was really hot, like burned my thumb hot. So I was like, that's not good. So I did some poking around. I thought I maybe bridge some contacts that would maybe do power, try to desolder them, try to brush away any like filings from the drilling I did. Nothing worked. So I put it in a bag and said, this is done. I messed it up. That's fine. It's just $10. It's fine. We all make mistakes, and that's why I said, if you break it, it's on you. So sometimes you just got to accept it that you broke it. I might I have a hot air gun now, which is a really nice tool if you guys don't have one. They're pretty cheap now, they're only like 30, 40 bucks. And you can try to reflow it, and that might work somehow, but no guarantees. But then I also lost the bag, so I didn't bring it tonight, so that's why it's not here. So I think I left it at my home about an hour away, so that's bad. But anyways, on to cameras. And more cameras from D-Link, because I'm obsessed with D-Link. This one I don't own, though. But you're thinking, why would I care about a camera I don't own? Well, later in the presentation I'll go to one ShowDan slide, and we've talked about this before, but I actually did a ShowDan search for DCS, and one of these popped up, just chilling on the internet. Okay, well, what's big with that? Well, if these are just chilling on the internet and they're running some weird firmware, let's say you have a specific IP range that you're scanning in a pen test, and one of these pops up on it, and you're like, oh, it's on the internet. And the company says, well, this is we watch our engineers work to make sure they're there, because a lot of them don't show up a lot. And their CEO wants to check in or something, so they just have it open to the internet, and that's not good. So as a pen tester, you might think, well, I could find vulnerabilities online using Metasploit, which is really easy. Or I could just buy one of these on eBay for 50 bucks or 75 bucks and tear it apart, find the vulnerability myself, and then find my way in through the web interface. So this is kind of a mid-range camera, but it also is pan and tilt, which is kind of interesting. And it's obviously from D-Link again, but I'm cheap, so I don't want to buy it. So how do you think I can maybe get access to something I physically don't have? And what can we learn about the firmware if we can find the firmware? Well, first let's talk about some firmware tools. So firmware is really cool. Like all these devices run some kind of firmware, and firmware is kind of this umbrella term for everything that runs on a device, any programs, anything like that. So I have some tools here. These are software tools. I have a couple hardware tools. Obviously the Arduino was one. This is an ST link for chips themselves. So this actually connects to the JTAG port of a microcontroller chip. And I'll tell a story about this at the very end, how I use this to hack something. But stuff like that is really nice for interfacing with chips. But software tool-wise, you have your obviously strings, which we talked about during the file one last week. And you can use that to find things in files that are kind of weird. That's really nice. You can use the file command to find out what it is, if it's like some LISMA thing, which is really common in firmware, and or just some zip drive that you just not labeled. Binwalk, oh my gosh, I love Binwalk. We'll talk about this later, but Binwalk is my favorite tool. It's really easy to use and has a bunch of weird, cool features in it that a lot of people don't know about. Also, you have, if you have the firmware but you don't have the device, or you have the software, you can actually use IDA to, I don't know how to say the last one. This is the NSA one. Those are the, what was it? Ghidra, that's how you say it. I always say it wrong. So Ghidra is the open source free one developed by the NSA. Run it at your own risk. It might have NSA malware on it, but probably not. But then IDA Pro is really expensive. So if you want to use it, you have to pay some, it's like $18,000 or something like that per year. So you can get it, but it's very expensive. Those are the software tools that you can use. I like Binwalk and strings because it's really easy. Binwalk, you just run Binwalk file. That's it. And it'll just pop up whatever it finds. And that can be really easy because you can say, oh, this firmware has the LISMA or whatever the firmware is. It could just be some Linux thing. You could just be able to chroot it onto your computer and just be able to have your own little Linux environment right there that you can base it off of. It looks for those magic bytes in the firmware, like we talked about last week, to find those, to find the starting points of everything. It does have false flags though, but most of the time it works. Strings shows ASCII files, or ASCII strings found in the file. Pretty easy to use, just run strings and then like TAC or -10 or whatever, and it shows the length of anything longer than 10 that's ASCII, that thinks it's ASCII. A lot of false positives, but can give you like passwords or something like that if you're just looking for that if it's unencrypted. So first we're going to go do the firmware demo here in Kali. So, am I in the right directory? Yeah, okay. So as you can see up at the top, is it Control Plus to go bigger? Yeah, okay. I'll clear this and make it bigger. So you can see I have a bunch of firmware downloaded, and a lot of them are, the name of that camera was DCS-5222L, and then there's a revision B, B1, everything like this. So you can see the PDFs are there because you get like a zip file and it has like the releases and everything like that. Well, what we can do is you can see that bin file up at the top underneath the downloads. Why don't we just run Binwalk against it and see what happens? So, B1.bin. So, we'll run Binwalk against it, and it might come back with something. Takes a little bit sometimes, because sometimes these are pretty big. These are might be like 200 or 500 megabytes. Oh, what's that? MySQL. That doesn't seem right. Well, sadly, this probably is encrypted or obfuscated somehow. Well, we could check by passing the -E flag in Binwalk, and it will run an entropy scan on the file. So what this does is it shows the entropy of the file. Usually encryption is supposed to be completely random, or close to random, really close to random, almost indistinguishable. And as you can see here, the 1 means that it's completely random or mostly random. And you can see this firmware is probably encrypted somehow. And this is a really cool way to tell if something's encrypted without being like, well, it might be, might not be, maybe poke around for a long time, but here you go. And then we can verify that it is. So now that we, well, let me go back to my slides real fast. So if you run strings or anything like that, it's just going to be nothing there. So we're going to move on to another camera, and I'll finish talking about that old camera when we get to the next demo. So this is a camera I do have, but it's just a tiny little camera. This is a little stand for it. It's pretty simple IP camera. Just connects to the connects over Wi-Fi. It has a little micro USB on the bottom. Tiny little camera, this big, fits in the palm of my hand. Has a little SD card slot on it too if you want to store video on it. Really cheap. Comes from Amazon for 20 bucks new. So you can guess if you find it on eBay probably for like 10, 15 bucks. And that's for like used ones that are probably beaten up and destroyed. But if you're doing firmware reversing and stuff like that, it doesn't really matter if it's beat up and destroyed as long as it works still. It has a speaker and microphone on it, which is different than some of the other ones, some of the other cameras. You can actually talk to people through this, which is kind of scary if you know about the Nest and the Ring stuff that's been happening where people get into these. Imagine sticking one of these on your network and just having it open to the internet and people being able to talk to it. That's kind of scary. And also spy on you in your house. That's also really scary. But if we move on. So let's go to what's inside. So if you look at the FCC ID, which is on the bottom base underneath here, there's a little FCC ID. If we type that into fccid.io, we're greeted with a bunch of a PDF and a bunch of images. And this is one of the images here that has, you can see the chip on the left and a bunch of debug ports. Now remember, I'm lazy. I don't like to mess around with things that I don't have to. So those are a lot of debug pins. It's not obvious. Like if it was just 4 pins in a row, I'd be able to say, oh, that's probably a serial port, maybe a JTAG port, which is really easy to deal with. I don't have enough soldering skills to solder those tiny, tiny little golden discs in the middle. I probably could if I tried really hard and messed around with them, but that's going to take me a really long time. I'm lazy. So if we do some digging around on Google, we can try to find the firmware. There's a link right there to the firmware for this specific thing. And if we open it up, it takes us to just a random site with a QR code for some reason for their app. But this is a Chinese company, so this camera comes from China, which is, you're not going to get the support you would if you even bought from D-Link, but whatever. You can see there's a bunch of different ones here, and this one looks similar, but it's not the exact one. This is the 1080p version, which is all the way down at the bottom. You can see, quick download. We have the firmware version. It looks like we're on 2.1.00E. I don't know, and then the date. So we can download that, and I'm going to pop over to Kali, clear this, and I've renamed it to this home_Y18, which doesn't come, it's just some random long name that they don't know how to name things, so there's also no extension on it. But if we run Binwalk against it, I think this is the right one, hopefully. You see nothing pops up this time. Ooh, that's bad. Usually something should pop up when you do something like that. You should say like Lizma or LYZA or anything like that. So if we run E against it again, capital E, we can see if it's encrypted or not. And yep, sure enough it is. Well, that sucks. But I have it though. So if I really wanted to, I can go find the debug port on it and dump the firmware. Let's go back to the slides. But yeah, so I had those in the slides. But we could go back to, as I was saying, we could go find those debug pins and poke around more, but let's just try Google first, because I mean, this is a pretty popular camera. It's sold on Amazon. I mean, they're really cheap. Someone's probably messed with it before. So I found this cool GitHub that has alternate firmware. So this has nothing to do. These people just want to run some like, I think it's RFTT or something like that. Some kind of video server or IP camera server on it, so they can broadcast their stuff out to everybody, or to their like Plex server or whatever they want to use, and some IP camera solution. So there's a lot of information here. Like you can put like Telnet on it if it doesn't have it, or like FTP, which is great. Somebody's already done the hard work for us. So also, like you can see here, this is the how to like flash it over the micro SD slot, so you can actually run your own firmware that way instead of over the network. But if we go back here, in the GitHub, I found this shell script up at the top, and it was originally in a zip file, but oops, don't know why that happened. But if we take a look at that shell script real quick, we can see. I'm going to zoom out again. That's too small. If we take a look at this shell script at the top, you can see there's a big block of public key right there. And what do you think that does? That probably decrypts the original firmware on there, which is awesome, because I don't want to have to dig around and find. This is the main thing we need. The public key is how you can decrypt the firmware from how the camera decrypts the firmware when it does a firmware update, because it needs to do it at some point. So it was somewhere on there. Someone already did the hard part for us, so awesome. We don't have to deal with that anymore. So this shell script just decrypts using OpenSSL. It's down here a little bit further. No, it's up here. Yep. It uses a chunk command, which I don't know what that does, but OpenSSL uses RSA util in OpenSSL and just decrypts the firmware. Really easy, really nice. I could probably write this if I had enough time, but I don't have to because somebody did it for us. So if we just quit out of Vim and we run this shell script, oops, forgot this. If you run this and then we pass, and then that's the reason why I had to name it home_y18m. Because it's the shell script is looking for it. You can change it to whatever you want in this shell script if you want. If we run this, you can see it finds the keys, the sum of it, and then it compares it, and everything's fine. So that firmware actually downloaded wasn't the one from the GitHub. I just downloaded off the site, so that key works still. So you can theoretically just do whatever you want. And every firmware update, you can just unencrypt, and then you have access to everything, and you can actually do vulnerability testing on this little folder right here, and it has all of the information there in the home directory. Sorry, let me go to home. And if we go to this directory, I don't know how to say that, but this is all ARM instructions code. So you can poke around there and do whatever you want. You can find vulnerabilities in it, find vulnerabilities in the scripts, whatever. That's kind of out of the scope of this. I don't want to go dive into that because I don't know a lot about it, but feel free to do whatever you want. Let me see. I think, yeah, so last thing, ShowDan. If you guys haven't heard of it, go check it out. It's great. They give free memberships every once in a while, which is really cool. You can type in the model number, and it'll sometimes just pop up because people just leave them on the internet. If you want more information, you can come talk to me afterwards, and we can. I'll show you how to do something like that in ShowDan. But yeah, it's a really neat way to find stuff that's just sitting out on the internet. You can kind of. If you know the device you're looking for, you can kind of go into the HTML and see like, oh, this is the stuff I'm looking for, or like unauthorized pages, I can find one string that I can kind of, that's unique to this device, and then search for it. But yeah. Some other cool projects. So I brought this. Some guy on Facebook, again, was selling these from his cabin. They're just power meters. Well, they have this little debug port right here. And as you can see, the blue part on that power meter is actually it correctly protected from writing the firmware on it. Because this uses actually light. Because when this is chilling on your side of your house or whatever, and there's usually a tamper tag that prevents people from just taking apart and messing with the power or whatever. So this isn't on right, but if it was, there's this little triangle right here that this like really expensive, like $500 thing plugs into, and you can actually write the firmware, write values on it. Really neat. I didn't know about this until I found this, but I saw this time. I was on like $2 for one of these, and I was like, can't pass that up. I mean, not every day you get to mess with one of these. So I was like, these are not cheap, by the way. These are like $200 or $300 new. So that's another project I want to research into, and that's something that like people don't even know that these things run. There's a little microcontroller in there, if you guys can see that. Like, a lot of people don't know that. Wouldn't it be really cool to be able to figure out how to like use this light thing and make your own thing? I don't know, but yeah. So last thing I want to talk about, are we good on time still?
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, okay, so this is what I want to talk about with this little JTAG reader. So you probably wonder why I have a picture of a scooter, electric scooter, and I have electric scooter, and sorry. This thing is really cool. It has Bluetooth enabled on it, and it has actually two microcontrollers, one in the battery, and then one in the dashboard, and one in the middle for the controller. The dashboard sends communications over like a 2-wire serial or 1-wire serial connection to the controller, and it says like go, stop, like how fast we going, blah, 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 everything like that. Well, in the rental scooter market, such as like Bird or anything like that, these are really popular. This is the 9-bot ES4 model. You some of you probably know where I'm going with this. But what I found out is that sometimes these get repossessed. So in the scooter market, if Bird did the Uber of the scooter market, they just went into a city, dumped them all over the streets, and then said, have at it. Well, it turns out that cities didn't like that a lot when you have a bunch of trash, just trash in their opinion, littering the streets. So what they did was they called up the tow company and said, go pick them all up. And so they repounded them, or they impounded them, and then they said to Bird, we've repoed them, or we've impounded them. If you want them, pay $400 or $500 per scooter. And we're talking like thousands of scooters. So Bird's like, nah, these are only worth like $500, probably less if they're wholesale discount from the manufacturer. So they said, we'll leave them. Doesn't matter, we'll just let them sit. So the repo or the impound tow companies say, gotta make money on this somehow. We have all these scooters, they're just sitting around. They're our property now because after a certain amount of time they expire and whatever. So you can buy them at impound auctions. So my friend bought 3 of them. And so he said, I have no idea how to do this. I have no idea how to get these working and have them be able to ride them because they're locked. Because if you turn them on, they'll just start beeping at you, and it's just really intimidating. Turns out that you can just take out the board, just rip it off, and it stops beeping, but you can't ride it anymore. Turns out that you just take this plastic piece off the top and stick in a dashboard, and then you flash some stuff in here, and that's what this JTAG is. I won't go into it because it's kind of complicated, and that might be another talk sometime. But yeah, so we got 3 electric scooters that work fine for pretty inexpensive, and yeah. So if you have any more questions, you can ask me about that and how I'll give you some more information about it. But yes, there's not any close auctions going on right now. I think the closest one was Richmond, Virginia, which is a little far. So yeah, that's it.
A quick announcement before we go. IASG 2 kickoff meeting is tonight at 7 p.m. in Cooper 3043. So if you're doing the cyber defense competition, I recommend you go to that to get a preview scenario and find potential teammates. Next week, I have a presentation from Logan on card reading shenanigans or something, and maybe you can do it.
Topic TBD.
Or topic TBD. Big insight from Whacker on radio stuff, hopefully. Other than that, see you guys next week.